How do political ideas and political problems lead the way to civil war? Our main topics are the ideas that the North had versus the ideas that the South had, liberty versus slavery, and my...
First of all, what was the Civil War? The Civil War was a war that lasted from 1861 to 1865, in which 7 southern states seceded from the U.S. and formed the Confederate States of America, also called the Confederation or the South. Then they grew up to 11 states. The North was declared the Union or the North. The major causes for the war were slavery, political ideas, and economy.
The anti-slavery movement. The anti-slavery movement was a movement in which the North supported the end of slavery and the Abolitionary Act was created. However, the abolitionists themselves divided themselves.
So basically, the division between the abolitionists themselves was basically Garrison, who believed in the emancipation by passing new laws will be pointless because they are being set from legal, and these laws would be unconstitutional. And Garrison also believed that women had to be allowed to speak in the anti-slavery meetings. But then the abolitionists who disagreed with Garrison formed the Liberty Party. This Liberty Party only won one fraction of the votes in the elections of 1840 and 1844. But the Whig Party, which had key states like New York and Ohio, gave the 1844 elections to James K. Polk, who is part of the Liberty Party. Also, tensions between the North and the South was slave escape. For example, the Underground Railroad, which slaves were escaping from the South to the North, and the Southerns didn't like this because North didn't allow slavery and Southerns did. So slaves escaped to the North so they can be free. The Southerns had resistance to abolitionism. That's why they were against the Northerns. Then early reform movements divided the American society, and they made the North and the South more distinct from each other. That's why rivalry grew between both.
The Southerners feared competition since they thought that the Southerners, that the slaves would take up their land, and also that they would take up their job opportunities since they worked for less amount of money.
How did the anti-slavery movement
lead to civil war?
The anti-slavery movement
was an idea
that led to
tensions
between the
North
and the
South
because they had
different ideas
regarding
slavery.
Meanwhile, the
North
believed that slavery should not be allowed,
while the South believed that slavery was a good thing.
So that created tensions between the ideas, which basically led to war. Migration was very important because immigrants moved to the North, not to the South. Because in the South, having slavery, this took job opportunities for the immigrants. So that's why the immigrants chose to move to the North and not to the South. This also made that the population of the North be twice as big as the population from the South. So inside the North, tensions were created because immigrants, Irish people for example, worked for less money than the people that worked in the North. So that's why in the North an American Republican Party was formed, which stated that people had to live and work in the United States for 21 years to have citizenship. So this was a political idea that divided among the Northerns for the immigrants and the people in the North. And also people in the South liked old traditional ways of economy. For example, they had their crops, etc. But the Northerns were new and more developed. They had industry, they were more developed, and they were more urban than the Southerners because they were rural. So this meant that the Northerners had more economy than the Southerners, which made that the Southerners be angry at the Northerners because they had better economy, and this created tension, which basically led to the war.
The coming of the Civil War. Some of the political problems and ideas that led to the Civil War were the annexation of Texas, slavery in territories, the Missouri Compromise, the Bill of 1846, the Compromise of 1850, and the well-being of the workers. The annexation of Texas was very important since it would increase the number of slave states, which favored the Southerners, and it would give them more representatives in the House of Representatives and the Senate. However, the Whigs and Northerners disagreed with this annexation since they, like Abraham Lincoln, didn't like slavery. Slavery in territory. In the 1840s, Congress faced an issue. This issue was whether to allow slavery in the territories acquired from Mexico. However, the Missouri Compromise did not settle this issue. In 1846, the bill stated that slavery would not be permitted in any of the territory acquired from Mexico. The Compromise of 1850, which would resolve problems, was when the compromise consisted of 5 laws, which were included in it. 2 of these laws favored the North and 2 favored the South, and the other was neutral. These laws were that the Congress would admit California into the Union as a free state. That law favored the North. The people of New Mexico and Utah territories would decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, and that was neutral. Congress would abolish the sale of enslaved people, but not slavery in Washington, D.C. That favored the North. Texas would give up claims to New Mexico for $10 million, which favored the South. And finally, the Fugitive Slave Act would order all citizens of the United States to assist in the return of the escaped slaves and would deny jury trials to escaped slaves. This last law favored the South. Finally, the well-being of the workers. The South did not take responsibility for the well-being of the North. The North did not take responsibility for the well-being of Northerners, since it focused more in industry. It was better than the South in terms of economy, and it was developed better. Southerners had interest in the well-being of the workers, however, of their slaves, while the North took no responsibility for their workers. The North was more urban, it had more industry, and the South was more rural and it had less industry. Thus, the North's population was twice as big as the South. All of these ideas and problems led to the Civil War because of the creation of more tension. Changes in political parties. So the first change is that the Whig Party goes down. The Whig Party goes down because many Northern Whigs abandoned the party because they weren't happy with its leaders that were supporting the compromise on slavery. Another issue that brought down the Whigs was the rise of the American Party, or the Know Nothings. Its members promoted nativism, a movement to ensure that native-born Americans receive better treatment than immigrants. In 1854, nativists went public by forming the American Party, which became known as the Know Nothings. It opposed Irish Catholic candidates and sought laws requiring immigrants to wait longer before they could become citizens. And finally, in 1854, a group of anti-slavery Northerners launched a new Republican Party that direct ancestor of today's Republican Party. Its members dedicated themselves to stopping slave power or the South. All of these political problems and issues that were increasing separated the country even more.
Increasing tensions between the North and the South. Neither the Kansas-Nebraska Act or the Compromise of the 1850 worked to bring the South and the North into a workable compromise. The Nebraska and Kansas Act stated three things: the creation of these two territories, that slavery would be allowed or not, and it basically broke the Missouri Compromise. So, in the same Kansas, there was division because Kansas had an anti-slavery capital and also had a pro-slavery capital, which also divided the same Kansas into two. The tensions in Kansas escalated into violent raids and counter-raids that won the territory the grim nickname of Bleeding Kansas. In the election of 1856, there were two political parties, which was the Democratic candidate, which is James Buchanan versus John C. Fremont, which is Republican. So Buchanan won the elections of 1856, and he would stop the agitation of the slavery issue. So Buchanan hoped that the Supreme Court would use its powers to resolve the issue for good. And the Supreme Court handed in one of the most controversial decisions, which was Scott versus Stanford. Scott was a slave who rebelled against his owner, which is Stanford. And the Supreme Court decided to make an act which favored slavery in Kansas. In Kansas also, there was a small pro-slavery group. Even though most of the people were against slavery in Kansas, at the end, Kansas ended up being a slave state.
The Lincoln versus Douglas debate.
Meanwhile, Douglas was a senator.
Lincoln was a no Republican that studied law. Their debate was about
the majority rule
over the minority right.
Douglas supported the popular. Meanwhile,
Lincoln did not believe that the majority denied the minority. He opposed the expansion of slavery, but did not propose forbidding slavery at all.
Meanwhile, Douglas did win the election.
Lincoln didn't win the election, but he gained reputation, and that would help him win. That would help him 2 years later.
The elections of 1860 was a really controversial theme because the Northerns, they wanted no Southern governor, and the Southerns did not approve an anti-slavery Republican in the North. So, could the Union survive? Divisions in the Democratic Party, which created the Northern Democratic Party versus the Southern Democratic Party. And also, other parties were also threatening these parties, which were the Whigs and the American parties. Also, a new party formed, which is the Constitutional Union Party versus the Republican Party, which Abraham Lincoln was the candidate for the Republican Party. There was no more national political parties, which meant that there were no more people that wanted a nation as a whole. These political parties had so different ideas that they favored different ideas that they ended up completely splitting the North and the South, which the North did not want slavery and the South wanted slavery. This led to the Civil War because it created conflicts between these political parties, which are the Northern Democratic Party, the Southern Democratic Party, the Whigs, the American Party, the Constitutional Union Party, and the Republican Party.
Lincoln won every free state except New Jersey, which he shared with Douglas. He also won Carolina, Arkansas, Delaware, Maryland, and the states of the Lower South: Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. In the South, Lincoln had no electoral votes, and his name didn't even appear in the ballots. However, in the North, he had 39% of the popular vote, which was 180 electoral votes, which was necessary to win the elections to become president. His victory was decisive, but exceptional.
Southerners seceded from the Union. They made the Confederate States of America, which president was Jefferson Davis, elected by the Southerners. However, Buchanan in the North thought this was illegal, but he would do nothing to prevent the Confederate States of America. He believed that it was illegal for states to secede, but he will not do anything to prevent it. Then, in the Confederate States of America, was made a last-minute compromise, which told that the states could return in peace to the Union. This was a really controversial idea because they believed how could states come and go as they pleased. Many Northerners disagreed strongly on this. Then Lincoln was elected president on March 1861, and he believed that secession was wrong. And Lincoln did not want to be the one who started the Civil War. The Southerners were outraged. They couldn't believe that a president was elected without their vote. So this confirmed the separation of the North and the South totally, because of the tensions that were made with the political ideas and political problems that the North and the South had.
The Confederate States forces fired a ship, and the Northerners had no supplies. So therefore, Lincoln had to resupply the fort. In order to do this, Lincoln had to choose between to fight to keep the fort or send new troops. But the problem with sending new troops was that he would be responsible for the start of the Civil War. On April 6th, Lincoln told the governor of South Carolina that he was sending food, but no soldiers or arms to Fort Sumter. On April 10th, before supplies could arrive, Confederate President Davis ordered General P.J.T. Burchard to demand that Fort Sumter surrender. If Anderson refused, Burchard was to take it by force. Anderson did refuse, and on April 12, 1861, Burchard opened fire on the fort. After a 34-hour bombardment, Anderson surrendered Fort Sumter to Confederate troops on April 14th. By firing on federal property, the Confederate States had committed an act of open rebellion. As a defender of the Constitution, Lincoln had no choice but to respond. When he called for volunteers, Southerners saw his action as an act of war against them. The upper South states of Virginia, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas now joined the lower South in the Confederacy. For the time being, the four border states remained uncommitted to either side. The fighting at Fort Sumter in April 1861 proved that the division between the North and the South could not be settled peacefully. Now a new question was raised. Could the Union be restored by force?
So these were the political ideas that Lincoln had that divided the country and led to the Civil War. These problems, these political problems and ideas led to the Civil War.